International Consulting Podcast. I am today with Gresham Harkless, which is the founder of CBNation.co. Hello, Gresham.
Hi, Johan. I appreciate you having me on.
Pleasure. So actually, we already know each other. I have been a guest on your own podcast. So you are a specialist actually of podcasting in general, and your website CBNation.co focuses, correct me if I'm wrong, about helping CEOs, entrepreneurs, business owners to create their business and to grow it and to succeed as entrepreneurs. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all focused on podcast videos and blog content to help entrepreneurs and CEOs and business owners succeed by hearing stories and getting resources to help them to be more successful and efficient.
May I ask, for how long are you in this line of business? When did you start?
That's a great question. I think that actually the first blog I started was called Herepreneur, and I want to say that might have started maybe like 8 or 9 years ago. It's been a while. It started definitely as a hobby, and I've always just been interested in entrepreneurship and business, and then it kind of manifests itself into what it is now. Became CB Nation, was CEO Blog Nation, became CB Nation, and all kind of our entities under it.
So actually, when you started this website, you became an entrepreneur at the same time, or you were already?
That's a phenomenal question. It's so funny because when I was trying to find out what I wanted to be when I grew up, I went back to a lot of things I did when I was younger. So I started a family newspaper when I was like 10 years old, where I used to find out all of the things that were going on in our family. My dad was in a different country because he was in the military, so he went TDY for a year. So I would send the newspaper to him so he could find out everything that was going on in our family. And I used to sell the subscriptions to my family members. But the reason I bring all that up is I didn't really know what an entrepreneur was. But when I look back at a lot of the things that I did when I was younger, whether it be selling potato chips or creating, beads to sell on the playground and things like that, I feel like I had tendencies without actually knowing what it was. But it was during the time that I started to interview entrepreneurs that I said, hey, I feel at home. I feel like I'm, talking about things I'm excited about. I feel like it speaks to me. And I kind of felt like I found my home and found who I was.
So actually, it was a passion already for a long time.
Exactly.
Nice. I guess you have interviewed many entrepreneurs in many different fields. Just anybody that goes on your website can see that you are doing a bit of everything.
Yeah, absolutely. I try to really touch on the different ways that people can take in content. So that's why, every site you go to, you'll see the listen, read, and watch. And the whole idea is that you can read blogs. If you like to listen, if that's your thing, listen to podcasts, like a great podcast like this, then you can listen to podcasts. Or if you really like videos as well, too, you get the opportunity to watch that content too.
Okay, amazing. And so you created a podcast, you run a podcast yourself. When did you start with your podcast?
Great question. So I used to do the blog interviews, and when I used to do the blog interviews, I would sit down with an entrepreneur and business owner, and I would record those interviews. I would ask them things like, why did you start your business? What advice would you have for new business owners? Just all of those questions. And I used to record it. And I didn't do anything with those recordings, but then I guess podcasting was becoming a little bit more popular. So probably about 5 years ago, I started what was called the CEO Chat podcast. And that podcast was more longer form. It was literally at that time just me taking those recordings, putting an intro and outro there, and then making it into a podcast. So that's really how it started. It ended up, evolving into a weekly podcast a couple years ago. But I really wanted to kind of focus and kind of streamline the conversation, make it a lot more kind of, scalable, so to speak, because I wanted it to be a daily podcast. So from there, from 5 years ago, I kind of invented what's now called the I'm CEO podcast, which you've been an awesome guest on. And it's been like a daily podcast that really asks, I think, some of the most impactful questions that I've been able to ask over the years, so that entrepreneurs and business owners can kind of learn and hear stories and learn how to be more efficient and effective themselves.
Do you have different podcasts, or is it still the same one you are running since 5 years?
It's two different ones now. The CEO Chat podcast at the time of this recording is a little bit more sunset, so it's not as weekly as it has been. So I've just really been focused on the daily podcast to try to get that up and going as much as possible. So over the last, I want to say 2 years that I've been doing that, I've always been trying to get it better and better and better and improve the processes, improve the host needs to improve as well too. So I always have to do a better job, but always trying to get better and provide more value.
Okay. Well, so actually, what makes a podcast a podcast? So you mentioned recording real life interviews, and now you move to internet, to online meetings. So yeah. What is actually a podcast in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really great question. And I almost feel like so many times people kind of confuse podcasting, because I feel like I wasn't podcasting when I was just recording the interviews. It wasn't until I put it in a podcast host, so to speak, that it became a podcast. And I started to have what some people might know as an RSS feed, which is basically every time you post something, you have that RSS feed. So there's one for podcasting. And when you put it on a podcast host, you can use like things like Podbean or Anchor or all of those different ways. Libsyn is another big one, Blueberry. But the idea is that those podcast hosts basically create a feed for you so that when you go to Apple Podcasts or you go to Google Podcasts, they basically subscribe to your feed, and that's how people are able to kind of take in your content. So I feel like podcasting to some degree is audio content, but I think when you're actually able to allow people to subscribe to it and have those feeds set up and people are able to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, to me, that's really when it becomes a podcast. But I think at the heart of what I'm hoping to do and we're able to do as well too here is just have a conversation. So I think it's just having a conversation, hitting the record button, and then trying to get it out to as many people as possible so that they can kind of learn from it as well.
Exactly. So actually, nearly anyone can create a podcast. And in your experience, I guess it is a great way to learn more about other businesses and to help other businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's definitely been that a way for people to learn more. And a lot of times, especially, pre-pandemic, a lot of people, I'm in the Washington, D.C. area, so they were always kind of stuck in traffic. So podcasting was a really great way to kind of take in content, take in information, learn from people, hear great stories, hear great conversations while you're sitting in traffic or maybe working out. For me, I always walk my dog. So those are different ways that I try to take in podcast content. And I've always felt like it's a really great medium because you don't have to, you can do it better when you're doing something else. So if you're driving, you can listen to a podcast. If you're working out, you can listen to a podcast. It becomes harder to do that if you're trying to watch a YouTube video or if you're trying to read a blog. You shouldn't do that when you're driving. You shouldn't do that, when you're working out. So a lot of times it allows you to really kind of multitask and do other things while you're listening to hopefully great content.
Exactly. So actually listening to podcasts is a great way to make the best use of some ideal time, like as you mentioned, walking out your dog or being stuck in traffic. Did you notice a change in your audience beginning of this year, as probably people are less stuck in traffic than before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely with the pandemic, there's all across the industry, there's been, a drop in people because everything is kind of shifted. There's been a disruption in the way that people are taking in content. So those regular habits that people had, especially in my area, where it would take an hour sometimes to get to work, you were listening to podcast after podcast, but now people are working from home. So they're consuming, content in a completely different way. So I think it's been of more importance for people to be able to drive, traffic. Probably, I've always been a big proponent of driving it, through the site, through the podcast site that you have. And I think that's been, elevated even more because people are now, taking in content in different ways. They're not sitting and driving, and some people are still haven't been back to the gym. So a lot of times those regular habits that people had on how they take in content have been completely disrupted. So yeah, we've definitely all seen it as podcasters.
Did you see a positive or negative effect on your audience?
I think it's been overall, it's probably been it's interesting because I think I was still kind of growing my podcast, so it hasn't been completely negative. But I just know as an industry, I've seen it. So I've been, one of the best things that I've been able to do too is get listeners from people that have been on the podcast. It's kind of like a community within itself. So as I have more podcasts, there's also more people to actually listen, more people to share it out. So because I've had it daily, that's helped out a lot. But generally speaking, like habits have, definitely changed. So I've seen an increase, but I think part of that is just because of the number of episodes, the number of time that I've had, the connections and outreach that I try to do, more so than I, was doing it for 5 years and then it just kind of stopped. So it's more a buildup of, I think, me kind of getting started and building it up and being more efficient and effective with the marketing too.
Have you noticed a shift from audio to video? For example, in my case, now that I'm working full time at home, I like to have a video cast playing on the TV, so I can not only listen when I'm working, but sometimes I can look at it and have a kind of a change of scenery, because otherwise it's just my my living room. Have you noticed this kind of behavior change?
Yeah, funny enough, I have YouTube Premium, which allows you to actually listen to videos, and you can be on different screens while you're listening to videos, and I think that just speaks to the different ways that people are taking in content, especially if you can't find the specific content you're looking for. You can often find it through YouTube, and then you're able to kind of search a lot better than you would maybe with podcasting, generally speaking. So I think that's allowed that opportunity for people that are looking for a video and they just want to listen, that they might be working out in the next room, or they might be cooking or something like that. They're not actually watching the video, but they're playing the video. And I think platforms like YouTube, they understand that, which they provide those opportunities for people not to have to sit there and watch the screen while they're listening. And I think that it speaks to really that multi-pronged approach that people have to take and should take when they're thinking about their content, because even if you have a video, people might be listening to that video. Even if you have a podcast, people might want to read and follow that transcript. So really having those different touches and different ways that people can take in content depending on how and what is more convenient for them has been absolutely huge.
Exactly. So actually, it is important to be on all possible mediums. So with audio, of course, recording the video, and also providing a transcription. So for somebody that is starting a podcast, would you recommend directly starting with video recordings?
I think that there's definitely a different connection you have with doing video. I think I'm a big proponent of really understanding like why you're doing what you're doing. Why are you starting a podcast? You start from there, and then you really understand like who you're trying to target. The reason I say that is because I think there's a lot of different ways to really execute your marketing strategy or your podcast strategy. And I think so many times we often hear we need to do X, Y, and Z because so-and-so is doing X, Y, and Z, when in reality, the real thing we should be following is our goal and our target market, and then working backwards from there. Now, generally speaking, definitely, you have a lot of opportunity to really build a stronger connection with video, because obviously you have the opportunity to see the person, you get to see the expressions, then you also get to hear it. So I think you have more touch points, which typically will result in a greater conversation. But that should say if the person or the people that you're trying to target are still commuting, they've been commuting this entire time during the pandemic, video may not be great for them because they don't really have the opportunity to do that because they're driving. So really understanding that might have you switch or tweak your strategy overall. So I think it's important to kind of make sure you answer those questions. But generally speaking, yes, absolutely. Video provides a stronger connection. It performs better across social media sites. And obviously YouTube is the second largest search engine and is also owned by Google. So it allows you to be found and be indexed a lot easier as well.
And regarding audio publication, which platform do you use, if you use one? Maybe use a platform that is itself sending your podcast on all of our publishing platforms?
Yeah, so funny enough, when I set it up, I actually set it up myself. So I actually set up all of the directory listings myself. So I didn't actually use one. But I will say this: when I did start the second podcast, the I Am CEO podcast, initially it was on Anchor. Anchor is a free platform that allows you to post podcasts, and they automatically will set up those directory listings for you. So I end up moving it, directly under one podcast host that I'm using now. But Anchor made it super simple and super easy. I think they call themselves like the WordPress for podcasting. So they made it simple for people to be able to just sit down and record, and then they take care of submitting it to Apple Podcasts and the Google Podcasts and Spotify and all of those places. So you didn't have to worry about that. So there's pros and cons of using a platform like Anchor, but it does make it super simple for people to use and leverage.
Actually, that's the one I am using, Anchor.fm, but you mentioned that you left it?
Yeah, I actually left it. So I merged my podcast together because I had them as two separate podcasts initially, and it ends up being a lot of work to try to get people to subscribe to both podcasts. So because they're the same topic, because it's just a different way that I had the conversation, like the CEO Chat podcast was more of a long form podcast, where the I Am CEO podcast is more laser focused. I wanted to just combine those efforts that I was having, and it's under the umbrella of CEO podcast, but it's all that same feed and same opportunity. So I merged both of them together.
Okay. And actually interviewing all these entrepreneurs, is it bringing you new ideas for your own business?
Yes, I'm an idea person anyways, so it's definitely been to the extreme now. Just really getting the opportunity to hear, people's stories, to hear how they really solve problems, because at the heart of entrepreneurship, it's always about solving problems. You really, I think when you start to flex that muscle, you start to see problems everywhere, and you start to think, how can I solve the problems? And then when you hear people and have them on the show and they start to say, okay, I saw this problem and this is how I solve it, it really starts to get and produce more and more ideas, really gets that muscle, working out even more. So yeah, to answer your question, I mean, there's some phenomenal people building some really awesome things to help out the world. And I think that can't help but, make you more idea driven and really focus on how you can solve these problems.
And have you been a guest on many podcasts?
I've been a guest on probably maybe 20 to 30 podcasts or so, not a tremendous amount, but it's something that I want to ramp up into doing a lot more. I'll tell you, the best thing that podcasting probably has done is it's made me more confident as far as my delivery and just having a conversation. I think one podcast I was on, someone asked me, when did I find my voice? And I said, I felt that I found my voice just from the repetition of doing and being on podcasts, that I don't worry as much about, what are the questions that are going to ask, is my microphone on it? Did I hit the record button? Just all of those things that I've made mistakes with. It's allowed me to really just be present and have a conversation just from like the repetition. So yeah, it's definitely been a great thing. But I think the best training, at least I can say, has been actually having a podcast to be on podcasts, which is weird kind of saying that, but it's definitely helped out a lot for me.
So you learn by doing.
Yes, exactly. I'm very much so that person.
I must admit it's the same in my case. And of course, the more we podcast, the more fluent the conversations can be. And although we understand more what to expect from a podcast recording, eventually how the guest will respond or sometimes not. And I think, I don't know for you, but in my case, it's what I fear the most, like the blank in the conversation and not knowing where to go next while we are recording.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like a lot of times when I have like an intro call for people on the podcast, I'll say a lot of times it's a lot like dancing. Like you are in like a club or something, and you're trying to figure out from your partner how exactly they're going to move. And I feel like the first couple of minutes you're trying to figure out, are they gonna talk a lot? Are they not gonna talk? Am I gonna have to ask a lot of follow-up questions? So you try to figure out exactly how that flow is going to go. Of course, you have the whole podcast to listen to, but it's definitely a flow, and you try to figure that out, at least in the very beginning, as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I definitely agree. So then we mentioned that if you do a podcast, it can be interesting to record video, to post the videos on YouTube. For the audio, to either use a platform as Anchor.fm or to manage yourself the publication on different podcast platforms. But it's also important to have a website, right? To support your content, to build backlinks, and how do you see the importance of having a website to support a podcast?
I mean, I think it's absolutely huge. I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit, just, not too long ago. I think what we're really trying to do is have our podcast and the message that we have get out to as many people as possible, and then definitely the right people. The interesting thing about podcasting is the discoverability of podcasts, being able to find podcasts is not as fluid. It's kind of a little bit kind of everywhere to some degree, because sometimes the biggest player is Apple Podcasts. But there's also Spotify, there's Google Podcasts. So a lot of times if you just take a poll and ask somebody how they listen to podcasts, sometimes people have their go-to player that they use. Sometimes they have no idea. And I think when we talked a little bit about, YouTube and having videos, that's more of a search engine. So it's very easy to kind of find those podcasts. And the reason that I bring all this up is because when you don't have a website, it makes it a lot harder to be able to have and find your podcast. If somebody is using, Apple Podcasts, then they could potentially search for your podcast. But the reason I bring that up is because a lot of times you can just say, go to www.yourpodcast.com, and allows your website and your podcast to be found there, because you'll be hosting the podcast episodes there. But on another standpoint, just from an SEO, it allows your site and your podcast to be indexed. So you have a lot more kind of direct consumer opportunities where people can come to your site, maybe search for exactly what the podcast episode is about and find it through there. Because a lot of times the people that might listen to podcasts, they're not really sure how exactly they're going to find the information. If you have a podcast on how to fix a vacuum cleaner, and say it's a very specific vacuum cleaner, chances are a person may not necessarily go to Apple Podcasts and search for that there, but they might go to Google to search for that there. So your podcast post and your episode can actually show up there, but that happens a lot better. You have a lot more control if that's done through your own website, because you kind of own that platform more than you own the other podcast platforms. So that's why I'm a big proponent of, having a website. I think it builds your foundation and allows you that opportunity to really grow and really get and be where people are searching. And when you don't do that, it's not necessarily that you definitely won't, but typically it becomes a lot harder for people to find and discover your podcast and all the great content that you're putting out.
So basically, if you want to start as a podcaster, you should also become a webmaster.
Or find somebody.
Or find somebody. For the website, not for the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of podcast hosts will, add on. Sometimes they have, like, I use Podbean. Podbean does allow you to have they basically, when you publish there, it'll give you like a site as well too. So those are different options. Sometimes they include them, but I would look into that and make sure that you have it. Obviously I do digital marketing, so I have a web design company, so we work on that ourselves. So we kind of have that internal, but yeah, it's just huge because people can find what you're looking for and what you're doing directly through your website. And with people not always kind of looking for content and looking for what you provide through the podcast platform that they might be using, or Apple Podcasts or whatever that might be, it allows you to be more discoverable.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And we talked a lot actually about podcasting, implying that when you podcast, you interview a guest, but you can of course podcast about many different things. There is probably nothing you cannot podcast about. You can podcast alone, but inviting a guest is actually a nice way, if you have your own podcast, to get more visibility, because your guest will of course share the result if he likes it, but we guess he usually does. And how do you have any advice actually to find guests?
Yes. So for me, I usually use about 2 or 3 different ways that I try to find guests. I think one of the quicker ways, maybe not so much quicker, but if you're getting podcast listeners already, don't be afraid to mention it in your intro and outro that if you want to apply to be on the podcast, or if you think that you know a good guest, go to this website or email us here, or do something like kind of a call to action for people to be able to submit to you other podcast guests or people that might be great, or even do self-nominations as well too. So that's been absolutely big for me, because I have kind of a targeted outreach. I also use kind of Instagram as well. So I call it hashtag hunting. I'll actually look for a specific hashtag. So I'm in the Washington, D.C. area. So one of the goals for me was to have more people that were local to the area. That was just one of the goals. So I looked for Washington, D.C. business, Maryland-based business, Virginia-based business, and follow those hashtags to find some of the businesses that were in the area. But you can, of course, do that on any social media platform. I just felt like Instagram was a lot more direct to the person or direct to the organization than other platforms. I've gone on Facebook groups and said, hey, this is my link. Would love to get more podcasts podcast guests because I'm always looking. So please submit here if that's of interest. But I think the biggest, which you've definitely been a guest on the show, obviously, but also you featured on our blog. So one of the things that I've been able to do is kind of also do outreach to people that have been featured on our blog. And my goal was just to kind of deepen the relationship, deeper the connection, so that, who knows, it obviously could be a podcast opportunity, but it might end up being something down the line. But I think that's one of the kind of underappreciated opportunities for podcasts, is really to develop and build relationships. And sometimes we know right then and right there how that relationship is going to blossom. Sometimes it might be years down the line. But I think if we take those actions and develop those relationships, then it provides a tremendous opportunity through podcasting.
Mm-hmm. That's for sure. So actually, what would be your best tips to generate business ideas from podcasting and to grow your business?
Yeah, I think so I have this talk I usually give where I say everybody is in the media business. You are a media company. And I feel like the most successful podcasters are able to have a business and use podcasting as like a marketing channel for their business. So when you say that, when you ask that question, I love it because I think it really speaks to the opportunity that podcasting provides. It's a way for you to connect potentially with your target market and the people that could potentially use your products and services. So I think our podcast is powered by Blue 16 Media, which is my digital marketing company. And the reason for that is it provides an opportunity for us to do advertising or to get our name out there a lot more than we could. So I think the best people that are able to leverage podcasts might have a coaching business, or maybe they do have a vacuum repair business or something along those lines. But if you're really able to niche down and say, hey, I'm the expert because of X, Y, and Z, you're either the expert because you know everything, or potentially you know the people who know everything, so you have them as guests on, and it allows you to kind of build your esteem, build your respect, and really have that opportunity to really be the go-to person. And I think that's something that a lot of people can really leverage, is having your own product and service and decide to use podcasting as a marketing channel or an opportunity to promote those products and services, or just using it as a way to kind of connect and build relationships and network, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So actually, the podcast should be an addition to the business that might bring new partners or customers for your business, right?
Absolutely. Have that multi-pronged approach.
Mm-hmm. Have you already seen that podcasting itself is a business for some people?
I think it can be. I think the interesting thing about podcasting is that you have to have a tremendous amount of downloads and a tremendous amount of people that are listening to your podcast, or you could potentially be very niche. And the reason that I say that is I actually had on my show, one of the other kind of goals I was hoping to have as other podcasters on my show. So I did outreach to other podcasters, and one of the podcast guests I had on did a podcast around spouses of doctors. And that was such a niche podcast that it allowed an opportunity for businesses, for her to make revenue very, very quickly, because it wasn't competitive. It was a very, very niche audience. So when you're able to provide something like that, you do have that opportunity to just do it from podcast. You can get the advertising opportunities if that's what your goal is. And for her, being able to interview the spouses of podcasts, there were other professions, like people that, you know, maybe dealt with, because sometimes spouses, those families have a lot of debt. So sometimes it might be debt, lowering your debt. It might be stress, because a lot of times those families are stressed. But there's a lot of different businesses that want to connect with that specific target market. And if you niche down enough, and especially if you're the only one doing it, you might be able to just do the podcast and to be able to generate revenue from there. But even if you don't get advertisers, there's other things like affiliate links and other opportunities that provide you that opportunity to really kind of be that go-to brand and podcast.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And actually, maybe one more advice for somebody that is thinking about starting a podcast, or also to grow its business from podcasting, would be to listen to your own podcast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. In my podcast, I would absolutely love you to listen to my podcast. And one of the things that we ask on the show is called CEO hacks. And those CEO hacks are like apps, books, and habits that people have that make them more effective and efficient. And some of those are affiliate links that we have as well too. So we merely just get a small percentage if somebody decides to purchase one of those hacks. But a lot of times people are saying really actionable things. I have things that I lean on all the time as well, but you can definitely listen to those on each and every podcast.
Exactly. So we should all subscribe to your podcast afterwards.
Yes, please do.
Well, for me that's already the case, but for our listeners, well, it was great talking with you, Gresham. So before we finish, maybe you can still tell us a little bit more about your business, which is not only the podcast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two different things that I always say that I focus on. So I have CBNation, which we talked a lot about, which is just all that B2B brand for entrepreneurs and business owners. And I have a digital marketing company. So we do web design and SEO primarily to help support entrepreneurs and business owners as well. And the real big goal is really to help people to increase their visibility, because I often say the name of the game is being found. So you're trying to figure out how exactly people are how and what people are searching for, and you're trying to have your content there when they're searching. And as I talked about, being your own media company for SEO, having blog content, podcast, video content really helps tremendously for SEO. So when you're trying to be there for what people are searching for, it's a great way to do that. So we just basically help people to create that connection, help them to be there when people are searching, and develop, more revenue, more opportunities. And that's pretty much the two things that I focus on more than anything else.
Okay, that's perfect. Well, it was amazing talking with you. So it was International Consulting Podcast, and I was with Gresham Harkless, the founder of CBNation and Blue.